The world of film has fallen silent. Diane Keaton, the woman who taught generations how to love awkwardly, laugh fearlessly, and age unapologetically, has passed away. She was 79. The news struck not with scandal, but with stillness, the kind that follows when a light that burned softly for so long finally goes out. For decades, she filled our screens with life, but in her final days, it was life itself she tried hardest to hold on to. Those closest to her say her last weeks were spent surrounded by her children, her journals, and the black and white photographs she'd taken over a lifetime. She spoke often of her mother, of time, of what it meant to leave something beautiful behind. And as her voice grew weaker, she began to reflect, not on fame or awards, but on the quiet truths that defined her, that she had lived without a script, loved without possession, and found art in imperfection. Yet behind that calm farewell was a story the world never saw, a life marked by loneliness and courage, by brilliance and doubt. From a shy California girl who once feared she'd never be seen, to one of Hollywood's most enduring icons, Diane Keaton's journey was never simple and never safe. And what she revealed in her final days changes how we see not just her, but what it really means to live a life worth remembering. Diane Keaton was born Diane Hall on a winter morning in January 1946 in Santa Ana, California, a town defined by routine, not dreams. Her father, Jack Hall, worked in real estate. Her mother, Dorothy, kept the house running while raising 4 children. The home was noisy, crowded, and filled with ordinary chaos, yet beneath it ran a quiet thread of yearning. Dorothy Hall wasn't just a homemaker. She was a diarist, endlessly documenting her life in thick notebooks lined with neat looping handwriting. Diane watched her mother pour emotions onto paper that no one else would read, and somewhere in that small act of secrecy, a seed was planted. The journals fascinated her. They were evidence that ordinary lives could still hold extraordinary detail, but they also frightened her, because they revealed what could happen to a creative woman who never found a stage. Dorothy wrote instead of performing. She dreamed instead of daring. Diane grew up wondering if she would someday do the same. In school, she felt invisible. Her dyslexia made reading difficult, her shyness made speaking harder, and her height made her stand out when she wanted to disappear. The nuns at her Catholic school described her as polite, withdrawn, easily distracted by imagination. While other children memorized prayers, Diane memorized gestures, the tilt of a hand, the flick of an eyebrow, small human details that would later become her acting language. She found refuge on stage. At Santa Ana High School, a teacher convinced her to audition for the drama club. Under the lights, words stopped slipping away. They became something she could shape. The applause startled her. It was the first time she'd been seen and not corrected. From that night on, performance wasn't just a hobby. It was survival. Her mother cheered her on, yet Diane sensed an unspoken tension. Dorothy's pride carried envy too. She had once been crowned Mrs. Los Angeles County in a local beauty pageant, a brief taste of recognition that never returned. Diane often said later that her mother's unrealized ambitions became her own fuel. She would take that spark, and instead of writing it in a diary, she would speak it aloud. By the time she was 20, Diane knew California could no longer hold her. She saved every tip from part-time jobs, packed 2 suitcases, and boarded a bus to New York City. The city was everything she feared, and everything she needed. Loud, cold, indifferent. She studied at the neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner, learning how truth could be built from observation rather than imitation. In 1968, she landed her first real break in the rock musical Hair. She was young, unsure, and the only cast member who refused to undress during the show. That defiance, quiet, polite, absolute, became the signature of her career. She would be daring, but always on her own terms. The decision didn't just preserve her modesty, it announced her identity. Hollywood might demand conformity, but Diane Keaton would always keep something for herself. When she joined the Actors Union, she discovered another woman named Diane Hall was already registered. On the spot, she borrowed her mother's maiden name, Keaton. It was a small administrative change, yet it marked a profound shift. The shy girl from Santa Ana was gone. In her place stood someone reborn, carrying her mother's name like a torch and a warning. Never let your story stay trapped on paper. The move to New York didn't promise security. It promised struggle. But Diane had already lived through silence, and she understood that fear was temporary while regret could last forever. In the cramped apartments of the Upper West Side, she rehearsed lines into cracked mirrors and believed, against every odd, that she could turn her mother's quiet yearning into something loud enough to last. New York was both thrilling and unforgiving, and for Diane Keaton, it became the proving ground that tested everything she believed about herself. After Hair, she struggled through months of small auditions and bit parts, often skipping meals just to keep paying for acting classes. Casting directors loved her look but found her awkward, too tall, too hesitant, too unlike anyone else. But what they called awkwardness was simply authenticity, and that would soon become her greatest weapon. Her break came in 1969 with Play It Again, Sam, a Broadway comedy written by a young Woody Allen. She was cast opposite him as a charmingly neurotic woman who matched his nervous energy beat for beat. Their chemistry was undeniable, a strange blend of humor and restraint that audiences couldn't look away from. When the play transferred to film in 1972, Diane's performance caught the attention of another director entirely, Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola was searching for the emotional anchor in The Godfather, someone who could humanize a story of corruption and violence. He saw something in Keaton's eyes, a quiet fear wrapped in dignity. As Kay Adams, she became the moral mirror of Michael Corleone, the only character who saw through the illusion of power. When the film premiered, critics focused on Brando and Pacino, but audiences noticed her. In every pause, every hesitant glance, she gave the tragedy a conscience. The success of The Godfather should have guaranteed confidence, but Diane was still fighting self-doubt. Surrounded by method actors and magnetic men, she often felt like an imposter. Yet that vulnerability made her real. And when Woody Allen began writing Annie Hall a few years later, he built the role around her entirely. Her speech patterns, her clothing, even her nickname. Released in 1977, Annie Hall changed everything. It wasn't just a love story, it was a revolution in tone. Funny, fractured, deeply human. Audiences had never seen a woman portrayed this way. Messy, intelligent, unfiltered, and irresistibly genuine. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Diane Keaton took home the Oscar for Best Actress. Overnight, she became the face of modern romance, and the voice of a new generation of women who were both independent and unsure, witty and wounded. Her fashion choices, men's vests, wide trousers, loose ties, became an international sensation. But for Diane, the style wasn't rebellion, it was comfort. She dressed like herself because she'd spent too long pretending to be someone else. Fashion magazines called her a trendsetter, but she saw it differently. I just wanted to be free. In interviews, she spoke softly, often deflecting praise with humor. Reporters mistook her modesty for shyness, but it was something else. She was always observing, studying people, learning what emotions looked like when they weren't being performed. That ability would define her later work. Behind the acclaim, however, was the beginning of a complex and private relationship with Woody Allen. Their creative partnership blurred with affection, but it was never simple. She admired his intellect and feared his intensity. Together they built characters who spoke for an entire generation. Yet off-camera she longed for distance, a life beyond the stage lights. She once said, "I was never Annie Hall, she was the person I wished I could be." By the end of the 1970s, Diane Keaton, had gone from a struggling New York actress to one of Hollywood's most intriguing figures. She'd won the industry's highest honor, but fame didn't quiet her restlessness. She was beginning to sense that success came with a cost, visibility without understanding, admiration without intimacy. And in the years ahead, that tension between who she was and who the world wanted her to be would begin to shape everything, from the men she loved to the kind of stories she chose to tell. Fame brought Diane Keaton everything she thought she wanted: respect, opportunity, freedom. But beneath the applause was a quiet ache she couldn't escape. The woman who had once played love on screen was struggling to live it off screen. Her relationships became reflections of her search for identity, deep, passionate, but always temporary. After Annie Hall, her partnership with Woody Allen evolved into something that was part friendship, part love story, and part mirror. They understood each other in ways words could barely describe, yet she always sensed a distance neither could close. Their connection thrived in creativity, but faltered in intimacy. When the relationship ended, she didn't mourn publicly. She moved inward, channeling her confusion into work that carried emotional precision. In 1979, she was cast opposite Al Pacino again in The Godfather Part 2. Their on-screen chemistry mirrored the push and pull of their real lives. Off-camera, they fell in love, drawn together by mutual respect and loneliness. Pacino was intense, unpredictable, endlessly focused on his craft. Keaton was drawn to that fire but feared being consumed by it. Years later, she would admit she wanted marriage, but he couldn't give it. When the relationship ended, it broke her heart, but it also freed her from waiting to be chosen. By the early 1980s, she began working with Warren Beatty on Reds, a sweeping epic about politics and love. Beatty's ambition was legendary, and the project demanded everything she had. The film earned her another Academy Award nomination, but the process left her emotionally exhausted. She admired Beatty's brilliance but recognized a pattern. She was always orbiting powerful men, becoming their muse, while struggling to define her own creative voice. Off-screen, she turned to photography. It became her private language, a way to capture fragments of reality that acting could never hold still. Her apartment filled with Polaroids, stacks of contact sheets, and snapshots of forgotten corners of Los Angeles. Photography, like her mother's diaries, offered control over memory, a way to frame what couldn't be fixed. Her public image during this era was contradictory. To the world, she was confident, quirky, self-assured. But those who knew her spoke of deep insecurities. She often doubted her worth beyond performance. In her journals, she wrote about aging, solitude, and the fear of irrelevance. Hollywood celebrated her as the woman who redefined femininity, but inside, she still felt like the awkward girl from Santa Ana who wasn't sure where she belonged. When Baby Boom arrived in 1987, Diane was 41 and ready for something lighter. The film, about a career-driven woman forced to care for a baby, struck a chord with audiences and became one of her most beloved performances. Ironically, the story of a woman learning to balance independence with love mirrored the lessons Diane was still learning in her own life. By the end of the decade, she had everything: critical acclaim, financial stability, artistic freedom. Yet she often described herself as lonely. She once said that every role she played was a small rebellion against fear. Fear of failure, fear of being alone, fear of fading. Acting for her was never escape, it was confession. In private, she began to understand what all her characters had been trying to tell her: that love wasn't about surrender, and solitude wasn't punishment. It was a choice. A chance to exist without losing herself in someone else's story. As the 80s closed, Diane Keaton stood at a crossroads. The world saw her as radiant, unstoppable, but inside, she was beginning to crave something more lasting than applause. Something real, something rooted. What she didn't know yet was that the next chapter would bring her exactly that, but not through romance, through family. By the early 1990s, Diane Keaton had reached an age when most actresses in Hollywood were quietly pushed aside. But she never accepted the industry's expiration dates. Instead, she reinvented herself once more, not as someone new, but as someone finally unafraid to be exactly who she was. In 1991, she starred in Father of the Bride, playing Nina Banks, a mother torn between joy and nostalgia as her daughter prepares to marry. It wasn't a flashy role, but it resonated deeply with audiences. She brought humor and vulnerability to the screen with such precision that it felt less like acting and more like witnessing a friend's private thoughts. The film became a generational favorite, and for the first time, Diane saw herself not as the ingenue or the muse, but as the emotional center. 5 years later came The First Wives Club, a sharp-edged comedy about reinvention after betrayal. The film's success was staggering. Older women who had long felt unseen in pop culture suddenly had heroes who looked and sounded like them. Keaton, alongside Goldie Hawn and Bette Midler, embodied resilience and grace with laughter that masked 1,000 private aches. She was no longer Hollywood's eccentric outlier. She was its mirror. But away from the camera, she began another chapter entirely. In 1996, she adopted her first child, Dexter, followed by her son Duke in 2001. Becoming a mother later in life transformed her completely. It forced her to slow down, to confront the vulnerability she'd spent decades avoiding. The woman who once hid behind characters and clever lines found herself standing in a kitchen, exhausted but content, helping with homework and worrying about colds. "I had to learn what unconditional love meant," she once said. "It's not perfect, it's presence." As her children grew, she began to write. Her first memoir, Then Again 2011, wasn't a celebrity chronicle, it was a love letter to her mother. Through Dorothy's journals, Diane rediscovered the woman who had inspired and frightened her in equal measure. She saw parallels she'd never wanted to admit: both dreamers, both record keepers, both afraid of being forgotten. The book became a quiet masterpiece, celebrated for its tenderness and truth. Her second memoir, Let's Just Say It Wasn't Pretty 2014, dismantled Hollywood's obsession with youth and beauty. Keaton wrote with the same dry wit that defined her characters, but beneath the humor was defiance. She had watched an industry trade authenticity for filters, and she wanted to remind women that life's lines and edges were not flaws, they were evidence. During these years, her acting career entered an unexpected renaissance. Something's Gotta Give 2003 paired her with Jack Nicholson in a romantic comedy about aging, attraction, and vulnerability. The film became a cultural moment, showing audiences that romance didn't belong only to the young. Diane's performance earned her another Academy Award nomination and a new title she never asked for: Hollywood's Most Desirable Woman Over 50. Beyond the screen, she turned her eye toward preservation and art. She restored historic homes, photographed architecture, and published California Romantica, a visual tribute to the state that raised her. Each project reflected the same impulse: to honor what time had built rather than erase it. By the 2010s, she had become an elder stateswoman of cinema, a model of endurance in an industry that rarely rewarded it. She appeared in ensemble films like Morning Glory and Book Club, not chasing relevance but exuding it. Younger actresses spoke of her as both legend and mentor, a woman who had carved out space for them simply by refusing to leave. And yet, beneath her jokes and charisma, she remained introspective. She still carried the questions her mother once wrote in those journals: what does it mean to matter? How do you know when you've done enough? She had lived her answers through work, children, and friendship, but she never stopped searching. By the end of the decade, Diane Keaton had built not just a career but an archive, a mosaic of emotion, memory, and grace. And as the world aged with her, her voice began to take on a new kind of power, not the urgency of youth, but the authority of reflection. The next chapter would test that strength once more, as her health began to falter, and the quiet she had spent a lifetime chasing finally found her. In the final years of her life, Diane Keaton retreated from the noise she had once mastered so effortlessly. She stopped accepting most film offers, quietly choosing presence over performance. Those who visited her say she had found peace in the ordinary, the hum of her garden fountain, the sound of her children's laughter, the stillness of late California afternoons. Her home in Los Angeles became her sanctuary, filled with black and white photographs, stacks of journals and framed letters from friends long gone. She often said she didn't miss the stage lights. What she missed were the conversations that came after filming, the late nights spent talking about stories, art, and meaning. She'd grown tired of pretending to be other people. She wanted, finally, to just be Diane. In interviews from her last years, her voice was softer, slower, but still alive with wit. She spoke more about gratitude than regret, more about her mother's diaries than her own career. "I was always afraid of disappearing," she once admitted, "but now I think there's a kind of beauty in letting go." The world last saw her on screen in Book Club, The Next Chapter, a light-hearted reminder that aging could still be playful. It would become her gentle farewell to the audience that had followed her for over 5 decades. After that, she stayed largely out of public view, focusing on her writing and photography. Friends described her mornings as ritualistic, black coffee, sunlight, and the quiet rustle of paper as she reread her old journals. But time, as she often said, has its own director. In the early months of her 79th year, Diane's health began to decline. It wasn't sudden, but gradual, a steady slowing of breath and energy. She faced it as she had faced everything, with honesty and humor. To her children, she joked that she was simply editing life down to the good parts. They stayed close, surrounding her with the same devotion she had once given them. There were hospital visits, then hospice care, and finally a return home. Her choice, her peace. Those final weeks were marked by reflection, not fear. Her daughter, Dexter, later said her mother spent hours by the window, dictating small notes about memory and meaning. "Tell people to keep things," she whispered once. "Pictures, letters, little moments, they matter more than fame." On her bedside table sat her mother's journals, yellowed with age, still filled with the handwriting that had started it all. When Diane Keaton passed away, it was in the company of family and music, her favorite Ella Fitzgerald record, playing softly in the background. There were no headlines, no spectacle, just a woman closing her story the way she had lived it, gently, deliberately, surrounded by love. The news broke quietly, and for a moment, the world stood still. Tributes poured in from across generations, actors, directors, and fans who had grown up watching her redefine what it meant to be authentic. They remembered her laugh, her awkward grace, the way she made imperfection feel like poetry, and somewhere it seemed fitting, because Diane Keaton's legacy was never about perfection, it was about truth. Her children have since pledged to preserve her archive, including decades of photography, film memorabilia, and handwritten notes for a foundation supporting women in film and Alzheimer's research. Her mother's influence, even after all these years, continues through that work. Diane's story didn't end with applause or ceremony. It ended with quiet. The same quiet that once surrounded a little girl in Santa Ana, listening to her mother write. Only now, that silence isn't confinement, it's peace. For over half a century, Diane Keaton lived between two worlds, the one that adored her, and the one that she kept tucked away, quiet and real. She was a woman who turned her fears into art, who taught audiences that vulnerability was not weakness but courage in its purest form. From the stages of New York to the backlots of Hollywood, she refused to bend to expectation. She loved deeply, laughed loudly, and walked away when the noise became too much. In her work, she gave voice to generations of women who felt invisible, showing them that age, awkwardness, and imperfection could all be beautiful. Her life was never about chasing fame. It was about preserving truth. Every photo she captured, every journal she filled, every line she delivered, they were all acts of remembrance, small proofs that life mattered most in its fleeting, honest moments. And now, as the lights fade, and the world replays her words on endless screens, one truth remains. Diane Keaton did not just live a remarkable career, she lived a remarkable life, one that continues to whisper to anyone who has ever felt unseen, "You are enough. You always were." For more emotional stories, check out this video.